Meaning's one of our instincts. Humans have the propensity to create a sense of meaning. And when I examine my own experience and the experience of patients or friends I've known well, it seems that the things that create meaning are actually.
Dr. Ron Siegel teaches internationally about mindfulness and its application to psychotherapy and other fields. As a clinical psychologist in private practice,
he has worked with low-income children and families, treated adults with chronic pain and stress disorders, and provided mindfulness-oriented psychotherapy. Dr. Ron Siegel.
When we've been injured, especially repeatedly, it's likely we're going to feel a lot of hurt and anger about that. That hurt and anger is going to manifest in some way. And one way that it might manifest is,
can we get in a time machine and just trace back to what inspired you to get into the field of mindfulness and psychology?
Well, the truth of the matter of how I got into this, I didn't used to be able to speak about, but I.
Welcome back to The Boundless Body. So check this out. 63.5% of you who are regular listeners haven't subscribed yet to the show. So please take a moment. It would be really helpful to click subscribe. It's free of charge. It will really help us out. In turn, we'll help you out by bringing you better and better content. Along those lines, send us an email with your feedback, boundlessbodypod@gmail.com. Send us your feedback about how you think we can do better. Give us questions to address on the show, interviewees you'd like us to interview. It'd be super helpful. Okay. Let's be a community.
Welcome, Ron, to the Boundless Body.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So I'm going to read your bio out and we're just going to jump into talking about being ordinary. It's really an extraordinary discussion talking about being ordinary because everybody's talking about being extraordinary.
Yeah, well, or at least being special.
Being special. Dr. Ron Siegel is assistant professor of psychology part-time at Harvard Medical School, serves on the board of directors and faculty, Institute for Meditation and Psychotherapy, and is the author of The Mindfulness Solution, Everyday Practices for Everyday Problems, co-author of Back Sense, a revolutionary approach to halting the cycle of chronic back pain, and Sitting Together, Essential Skills for Mindfulness-Based Psychotherapy. He's co-editor of Mindfulness and Psychotherapy, second edition, and author of the new book, The Extraordinary Gift of Being Ordinary, Finding Happiness Right Where You Are. All right, Ron. So can you tell us a little bit about what brought you into the field? Can we get in a time machine and just kind of trace back to what inspired you to get into the field of mindfulness and psychology?
The truth of the matter of how I got into this, I didn't used to be able to speak about, but I can now because there is so much work being done in psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy at major medical institutions and other sort of legitimate institutions in the culture. It actually started with a psychedelic experience when I was about 17 years old.
You're a free radical.
Yeah, well, it was, it was nothing out of the ordinary at the time. Actually, I was living in suburban New York, and it was a countercultural time where many of my peers were interested in the same things. And I had actually read a book about psychedelic journeying. We called it tripping back then, suggesting that if you approach it with a certain attitude, there'll be some powerful psychospiritual growth. I approached it with that attitude. I had a rather profound experience that felt life-changing at the time and felt like it gave me insights into the nature of self and the possibility of profound peace. So that got me interested in studying religion. I had majored in religion as an undergraduate, and that brought me toward psychology. So my entire career has had to do with the sort of synthesis of what we learned from meditative traditions and other spiritual paths and more mainstream psychology. And that actually brought the way into all these different books and the like. And ultimately that brought me to this most recent book.
Interesting. So your religious studies was a kind of cross-cultural religious studies program?
Yeah, very much. I wasn't particularly theistic. I had grown up quite secular. I really studied what are the different pathways in different cultures toward transforming our relationship to our sense of self, toward what are called mystical or transpersonal experiences, these experiences in which we no longer feel separate and isolated, but feel connected to something larger than ourselves, whether that be God and a theistic tradition or another divinity, or connected to nature, connected to common humanity, connected to animals. It takes a lot of different forms.
So you must be aware of the great phenomenologist of religion, Eliade,
Mm-hmm.
Mircea Eliade. I love that guy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he's really looking for shared themes and shared tropes and shared images and things like that. And it's kind of fallen out of vogue to think of it like this, even though you have the perennial philosophies, right, that are looking for the similarities and apparent differences. But Eliade was just an intellectual giant.
It's interesting that the current wave of research happening here at Harvard and a lot of other medical institutions in psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy has actually brought back into vogue this looking at what are the commonalities among these different spiritual paths, because people so often encounter these transpersonal experiences in psychedelic journeys, and they interpret them, of course, according to their particular cultural proclivity, what tradition they were raised in and the like, or what their current metaphysical belief system is. But people do have these remarkably parallel experiences.
One of the things that Eliade writes a lot about is the axis mundi. You familiar with that term, axis mundi? What the heck is an axis mundi? Will you tell our audience? We haven't talked about the axis mundi, but since I have a phenomenologist of religion here, I figured we might.
Well, I'm not. I will say, while this was my undergraduate major, it is not my area of expertise currently. But my understanding, if I remember correctly, was axis of the world, right? It's a kind of sense of what it relates to these perennial philosophies, right? What are the truths that become apparent in a great number of different spiritual traditions? And my understanding, I don't recall his work that clearly, but what shows up across religious traditions is a sense that our preoccupation with ourselves, and particularly with our kind of social rank and how we compare to one another, and our fluctuating self-esteem, whether we're feeling good about ourselves or bad about ourselves, these kinds of preoccupations miss our another level of experience in which we are profoundly interconnected, and all these worries tend to fall away.
Yeah. So Axis Mundi, it's a cosmological center with a capital C. So like, for example, in the Nation of Islam, the Islamic tradition, it's the Kaaba, where there's an opportunity to go on a pilgrimage to the center with a capital C. In kind of earth-based indigenous societies, it's often, ritualizing the center. But what is that? It has to do with the extraordinary. That it's an interesting discussion, there's this discussion between extraordinary and ordinary, because at the core of so many religions, you have this orientation to the extraordinary. So you have a ritualization of the center, a recapitulation of the cosmology to kind of invoke the origin of that society in the here and now by making a ritual center. That's the axis mundi. And by creating an extraordinary circumstance and experience for everybody to be renewed.
Yeah. But ultimately, where that renewal leads, as I understand it, is to profound sense of ordinariness. The renewal leads to profound humility, profound sense of, oh, well, here I am briefly on this planet, doing what I do on this planet briefly, but I am not so nearly so important as my constant narratives about myself would suggest.
Yeah. It reminds me of Carl Sagan's Pale Blue Dot riff. You remember that one?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Where there's this zooming out in a perspective from somewhere far out in the universe, and Earth is just a pale blue dot.
Yeah. No, and this perspective taking, you see it in the bumper sticker, whoever has the most toys when they die wins. Given the reality of birth and death, so many of our preoccupations they really don't make a lot of sense, even though they cause us tremendous suffering during our lives.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's a bit of a paradox, the extraordinary and the ordinary. I think there's there's a drive in the human. Otherwise, we wouldn't be in our predicament and we wouldn't have so much fragmentation in terms of, like, we could say the battle of the extraordinarynesses. You know what I mean? Like, I'm more extraordinary than you because I have this particular technology or this lingo. In a way, it's kind of a battle of opinion or a battle of types of extraordinarynesses. Is that even a term, extraordinarynesses?
Well, it is certainly true, and evolutionary psychologists have studied this extensively. It's certainly true that we humans will endlessly find criteria to evaluate ourselves and compare ourselves to one another, and to create social ranking. In other words, to create some kind of hierarchy where I'm better than you or you are better than me. And it doesn't take a lot of study of anthropology or history to realize there's been a pretty big theme among human beings, this getting into some kind of hierarchical judgment about who's better, what's better, and how do I become somehow on top of this pile rather than on the bottom of this pile. Interestingly, the evolutionary psychologists who study this say it actually comes from this very powerful mammalian preoccupation with dominance. If we were to go to the African savannah on a so-called safari and drive around in a Jeep with a naturalist, the naturalist would point out the same pattern in species after species. There would be a dominant male surrounded by literally a harem of reproductively promising females. And then over in the next field, there'd be a bunch of younger guys doing the species-specific equivalent of playing basketball or football, trying to get up the chops or the ability to become dominant again, to take over the dominant role. What's up with that? And why are there species of crickets that if you put them in a box, inside of a few minutes, they'll organize themselves into a dominance hierarchy? And even human children, well, by the age of 4, they're constantly organizing themselves into hierarchies of social standing and social rank. Something very powerful is going on that has us preoccupied with this kind of stuff.
Well, it's a good thing that it's happening everywhere else besides the healing arts, because healers have gone beyond that, right, Ron?
Oh yeah, certainly. You'll never see competition about which school of psychotherapy is better than which, or which spiritual tradition is the true one.
How many likes you got, Ron?
Exactly. This stuff is so supercharged in the current era, where we've got these constant technological feedback systems that, how many followers to your podcast, how many likes are you getting, how many patients are asking for your services versus the person next door. The opportunities for comparing ourselves to others are quite endless.
So thinking about the what Robert Moore, the Jungian writer, called the archetype of initiation, where you have the neophyte, the newbie coming into whatever it is. It could be Hakomi or somatic experiencing, or those are some of the somatic psychologies out there. But you start as a neophyte. And there's an element, honestly, there's an element of kind of humiliation in the process, in the archetype of initiation. It's nicer than that in this day and age, but I think the part of the structure is to reflect to the neophyte that they're basically nothing in comparison to the one at the top. I taught craniosacral work worldwide for quite some time, and it's an initiatory paradigm, or an activation transmission paradigm. You've heard this? Did you get the transmission from the one at the top? And when you're in proximity to the one at the top, then the neophyte, gets initiated, but only at the bottom rung because of proximity to the center, because the leader is the axis mundi, of course, the one who transmits. And then, of course, there's a long process, often humiliating process, depends on who you're asking, of course, as the person crawls up the ladder.
What's interesting, too, are the kind of idealizations we have of people at the top of these hierarchies, including idealizations around, enlightenment or awakening. In the psychology realm, there was an idea for many decades that in psychoanalysis, you could have a completed analysis where you'd, in essence, work out all of your conflicts, all of your neuroses. And a good friend of mine wears a number of interesting hats. So he's a professor at Harvard Medical School. He's a psychiatrist. He's a psychoanalyst. He's the director of the longest running study on adult development and well-being, the Harvard Study of Adult Development. His name's Bob Waldinger, and he's also a Zen priest. So we've had a number of conversations about these hierarchies and this idea of the enlightened teacher on top. And he suggested, I think it's enlightenment pornography.
I almost popped out my headphones on that one.
Well, these are airbrushed images of arriving, whether that's as a skillful psychotherapist or as the guru or as the enlightened master. And it may not actually work that way. It may be that we're all working on ourselves throughout our entire lifetimes. And in various areas at one moment or another, we may have more clarity or less clarity, but that these fantasies of arrival or hierarchies within psychological and spiritual development are simply fantasies.
It's interesting. It really does play out in these social dramas. When I was teaching craniosacral therapy and I was at the kind of top of the transmission thing and being the recipient of the idealization, there'd be these moments where I'd be giving to a student and there'd be a circle of other students around us and I could just feel the idealizing projections, and there's this kind of sense of, oh yeah, there's some enlightenment porn going on here, right? Because I'm less enlightened than the projection, right? It's but it's part of this the structure. It's the linchpin of the social drama.
And people's hunger. It is so hard to be a human being. Every day brings, yes, it may bring joy, but there's not a day without suffering. And especially if you're at all open-hearted and you look around you, my God, the pain in the world. Given this, the fantasy that there would be someone who is free of the things I'm suffering with is a very, very powerful fantasy. And of course, we're drawn toward that and we want to project that onto others. But I think we actually do a disservice to people who are students by not correcting the problem with the projection and helping everybody to be more comfortable with who they are, given how hard it is to be a human being.
So the Jungians are quite good at challenging hidden idealizations, hidden grandiosities, and I really want to honor the Jungian tradition for supporting me in that. For example, Robert Moore, again, his work, Idealization and Evil, he did a lecture called Idealization and Evil, the relationship between positive and negative idealizations and human conceptualizations of evil. And he's making a link between like these negative and positive idealizations, which we're essentially swimming in, as a collective. It's like, okay, it's not really a question of, is there an idealization? It's like, where is it?
Yeah. And it's very interesting that to the degree to which, to follow your Jungian theme for a moment, to the degree to which we can be comfortable acknowledging and seeing our own shadow, our own areas where we feel inadequate or not so noble, or areas of shame. If we can make friends with those, then we become so much more accepting of other people because we're no longer taking our negativity, projecting it onto them and saying, oh, look at that bad other. We see this in the political sphere so much where whoever the out group is, they're always seen as sexually promiscuous, dishonest, not smart, untrustworthy. It's all the elements of ourselves that we don't like. We project onto the out group or onto our partner when we're angry with them. This stuff, we cause a lot of havoc. And the degree to which we can start to become comfortable with our own flawed nature, everything gets better.
Yeah. So in my book, I draw a lot of parallels between idealization and innocence. Because I see this as kind of like the shadow side of the idealizing dynamics is a claim to innocence, like an unconscious claim to purity and innocence, which I think dovetails with what you're talking about. I'm innocent and pure. And this is common everyday domestic stuff, right? Like we're in an argument, we're in a domestic situation, right? And I claim to innocence, and I have a claim to innocence and you're the bad one. You started it, Ron.
Right, you're right.
You started it.
Right.
And I remember exactly what you said,
There's a wonderful cartoon. It's a family, and they're in some jungle-like environment. They're all wearing pith hats and backpacks, and they're looking at a map, and everybody's looking quite confused. And I think it's the father who says, "Okay, agreed. We're completely lost. But the important question is, whose fault is it?"
Yeah, that's high satire right there. I really appreciate that. The political climate is just absurdly horrifying. And the satirical dimension gives me a little bit of freedom. Like humor, I think this is one of the vectors or one of the directions that can loosen up idealizations in a way that doesn't strengthen the positive negative split. You know what I mean? Like it holds up a mirror to people's humanity.
Mm-hmm. And you see some of this humility in some spiritual and psychological teachers. There was Dogen, who I believe in 12th century, something like that, Zen master, for whom the whole kind of Southern Zen tradition, the Soto tradition, followed from his teachings. And he was near the end of his life, and people were saying, want to hear his wisdom. They said, gosh, after all these decades of your personal spiritual practice and as a teacher, when you look over the arc of your life, how would you describe it? And Dogen said, "Oh, one mistake after another."
Yeah.
And I love it.
Yeah.
Because it speaks to the reality. As a psychotherapist, many people enter psychotherapy with a secret wish that they could get a whole new personality. I won't have to be neurotic Ron anymore, who's got social anxiety or who obsesses over things that are silly to obsess about or who has trouble sleeping at night. I'll get to be like this other person who I imagine to be strong or confident or skillful in ways that I'm not. And when psychotherapy goes well, and usually this is long-term psychotherapy usually, what happens is Ron is still Ron. We're still very much ourselves at the end of the psychotherapy, but we've kind of made friends with this person, with this lovable, compassionate, nutty mess, right? That's who we are, but we're more at home with being that person. And to start to see that as a goal of psychological and spiritual development, as opposed to fulfilling one of these idealized molds that you're bringing our attention to, that's an interesting shift. And that's this book about being ordinary. That's the extraordinary gift of being ordinary, when we can start to actually be friends with this confused, confusing, imperfect being that we are, rather than be chasing after these idealizations or trying to come out ahead in our comparisons with others.
Mm-hmm. So I'm just thinking about my own process, my own relationship with idealizations, and I'm asking myself the question, because I'm gearing up to ask you this question. How did I start to get on the hunt or get on the trail to understanding idealization dynamics? And I'm thinking to myself, it must be because a prior idealization failed me in some significant way. And I'm thinking to myself, when I was on this aesthetic Buddhism and yoga track, and I put every ounce of my energy into it, I catapulted myself into, something like 8 hours of yogic ascetic practice a day or something like that. And you would probably guess that, it must have been in your 20s. Yep, early 20s. And there's a way in which I feel, after being in it for years, that it failed me. Mm-hmm. And it crushed me at first. It completely crushed me. And I eventually found myself in Jungian therapy, and the intellectual stuff helped me to frame it and to gradually pull myself out of the pit. But I found myself at certain stages being really angry at the idealization that it didn't give me the thing that I thought I was going to have. but I'm really happy today in my heart. There's this deep, my 5-year-old daughter has this wonderful phrase recently that she's been saying. She says, Papa, do you have happiness in your heart that's really far down there at the bottom?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I said, yeah, well, what about you? And she's like, yeah, really, really far down at the bottom. And I can feel that, you know, when I'm with a colleague that has this, when I'm speaking with somebody that has this lens, something just opens up.
Mm-hmm.
And because there's something grippy and Velcro-y about the idealization, that everything kind of seems to collapse into that direction. And it's like, is there real freedom to connect? Is there real freedom to even go to the bottom of the heart and be in the happiness of just being in it together, kind of like alone in this moment together? We got no idealizations and in some ways it's horrifying, in other ways it's glorious. Some ways it's extraordinary, other ways it's just ordinary. We're just humans, we're going to die, we're doing our best to make meaning.
Yeah, no, what your daughter's saying is quite beautiful, and connecting with her around that is particularly beautiful, because when we start looking for antidotes to being preoccupied with self-esteem and how we're doing and evaluating ourselves positively or negatively, and that whole roller coaster, when we start looking for antidotes, probably the most powerful one is when we start to make a connection rather than an impression. When we start to be interested in, Ram Dass used to say this, he'd kind of play like he was knocking on the other person's forehead and say, that you in there? You know, a sense of soul to soul or vulnerable person to vulnerable person connection like you were making with your daughter. Because when we're connected with someone that way, even if we're just having an honest conversation with a good friend and neither of us is posturing and we're both talking about, you know, the ways in which it's joyous, but also quite difficult to be alive as a human being in this way. And those moments, all this stuff about idealization and how do I compare to you, all of that starts to fall away. And we start to feel this very sweet sense of love and connection, which is really a pathway out of these other preoccupations. And it is a shame that so many spiritual traditions that I think have as their goal, really, simply this kind of warm-hearted connection, get caught up in forms of practice and hierarchies of practice that make people think, oh no, you know, I've got to strive super hard to reach this other stage that has nothing to do with just me being a regular human being here.
Yeah, well said. Was that the book that you were referring to earlier, Ron, Be Here Now?
Yeah, no, well, Ram Dass, I heard him talk about that once. I'm not sure if it's in the book or not. Yeah.
An archetypal moment in my life was when I had finished my business school in Madison, Wisconsin. And I was like, this is not for me. And so that's when I got in my truck and I drove out to California to work at a healing arts school and become an aesthetic. You know what I mean? And I remember driving out in my car, in my truck, and I had an old audio cassette of Ram Dass speaking at Naropa Institute in like something like 78, doing a lecture about the Bhagavad Gita. And I remember him, because he was onto this idealization stuff. He was onto it. And I remember him quoting Walt Whitman in just such a beautiful, lucid way. And he said something like, trippers and askers surround me. Just that phrase, you know, kind of like rung through my system as a bell, right? Because there's this trip about how to get to the top or how to get to that fantasy place post-analysis, post-therapy, post-crawling up the rung of whatever ladder it is for this training. I mean, if you look at my CV, I have like, I don't know, 20 trainings in this modality and that modality, all looking for that kind of like that result, that piece, that place that is beyond the social anxiety and the sense of fragility and the fear of that a lot of us humans share.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, actually, the backstory to the book I mentioned was about, I don't know, maybe 6 years ago or so. There I was already in my 60s, having spent a good 40 years involved in spiritual practices, in my case, particularly in Buddhist traditions, same amount of time working as a psychotherapist. And you would think that I would have developed something like a coherent, stable sense of self, but nothing of the sort had happened, right? That I still noticing my feelings, my mood going up and down with good or bad fortune. I would have a psychotherapy session that went well, and I'd think, yeah, I've really developed into this well-oiled machine, all these years of personal practice and exploration, all these years of professional training and work, and look how effective I am. And then I'd have another session that wasn't going well at all, and I think, this clearly isn't my calling. I was a good student. I could have gone into so many fields. And I'd notice it just going up and down, or I'd get invited to speak at a conference. And I'd think, oh yeah, I'm making meaningful contributions to my field. And then a friend would be invited to speak at the conference and I wasn't. And it's like, I'm a has-been. So noticing, these constant fluctuations, not huge all the time, but with every email, with everything going well or not. And I started thinking, well, what's up with this? How have I been such a complete failure at these practices that I've been involved in? And, one hypothesis was, well, I'm just inadequate, or getting picked last to the kickball team in the third grade knocked me down and I never quite worked it through. But the other hypothesis was this stuff's pretty universal. And, this tendency to be judging ourselves, and whether it's in terms of the idealization, I should be like this other person after all this practice, or whether it's the more mundane, that guy's more physically fit than I am. Look, that person's more knowledgeable than I am, whatever, starting to think, okay, let's go with the idea that maybe this is universal, because certainly all of my patients struggle with this stuff. All my colleagues seem to struggle with this stuff. Maybe there's something pretty universal. And if that's the case, what might we be able to do about it? Because just striving for, enlightenment and, or the highest rung on these spiritual ladders doesn't seem to be doing the trick for a lot of us.
Yeah. Yeah. So you mentioned the relationship. I'm glad that you threw in Buddhism and your own practice, your own interest that you've been immersed in for so many years. I'm glad that you threw that into the mix of idealization, because it's the idealization is the glue that holds religious dogma together. You know what I mean? And so can you talk a little bit about how did you reach this understanding with your own beliefs, your own practice, your own Buddhistic practice? Because not everybody goes there by any stretch of the imagination.
Well, interestingly, at one point, it occurred to me that we could kind of reverse engineer the Buddha's teachings, because, he was mostly teaching to monastics, right? And what he prescribed for these monastics was have no possessions except for, a bowl that you would, ask for food to be placed in, and a robe. Couldn't handle money, couldn't have sex, weren't going to have a family, super simplified. And then there were some 500 odd rules that the monastics were supposed to live by to get along with one another. And if we sort of reverse engineer that, the Buddha was implicitly saying, if I engaged in life more loosely than with this pattern of, no possessions, no money, no sex, prescribed relationships, I can't imagine being enlightened or being sane, because otherwise, why is he prescribing this stuff for people, right? That, this is the pathway to freedom. So first off, that I find enormously reassuring. It's like, of course we're nuts. Of course, we're not experiencing these states of mind that may be spoken about in the literature, because most of us are living much fuller lives than that. And when we're mammals interacting with other mammals and families and businesses and whatnot, all sorts of feelings are going to come up. Mm-hmm. That relativized it for me. It's like, okay, maybe there are some monks who have these experiences of full falling away of greed, hatred, and delusion, but certainly hasn't happened to me for more than a few minutes at a stretch, and doesn't seem to have happened to my friends who are honest with me. So I'm gonna shelve that as a goal and see about. There's a Scottish monk, Buddhist monk, who talked about the goal of practice to be a compassionate mess.
Nice, yeah.
And see if I might pursue that path because it just seems a lot more realistic given my observations of my own heart and mind, and helps to be a psychologist. It's interesting when these Asian Buddhist teachings have encountered Western psychology. A lot of my work for decades now has been the integration of mindfulness practices into Western psychotherapeutic practices. And while mindfulness practices and Buddhist psychology have a lot to offer us in Western psychotherapeutic traditions, Western psychotherapeutic traditions have a lot to offer the wisdom traditions that Buddhist practices come from, and particularly in the realm of understanding emotion, learning how to be with and embrace and honor emotion, and understanding the super intense importance of our relationships and our connections with one another, and love in very ordinary ways, and how we're going to work with anger when it comes up, how we're going to work with longing, how we're going to work with being an embodied mammal in a social network and being super social creatures. So that has, for me, relativized the Buddhist practices to not be thinking about some wooden or stone statue, but rather a little bit more like Dogen, one mistake after another. And how are we going to apply this in our everyday lives?
Mm-hmm. So there's plenty of people out there in the world. I kind of dislike the word cult because wherever I look, I see cults of personality, now I'm aware that there's formal definitions of cults, but to me, the distinctions fall pretty flat. I see it as a kind of social control dynamic, the kind of the imperative of a social system to create hierarchies like we've been talking about, and how it absorbs neophytes in and then kind of entrances people such that their flexibility of thinking goes way down. It becomes just one path and one way of understanding and one belief. I see kind of rigid beliefs altogether as being expressions of cult dynamics. And there's so many people out there in the world that arrogate themselves to being at the top of the cult and assuming a position that is basically an enlightened position where you have the transmitter and so on. So it's like, I see it as kind of like a social field that creates that. It's like almost like a social agreement. The teacher, the transmitter, and the enlightened one just needs to convince a certain amount of people and reach a certain threshold before there's a collective narrative. And now we have a social drama.
Right.
How would we know that what's happening today is any different than what happened in Buddha's day?
Yeah, no, I assume this is terrible. And a lot of my dear friends are more orthodoxly religious in Buddhist traditions than I find myself being. We might take the stories of enlightenment that we see in Zen traditions and other traditions as kind of marketing, the same way that, and I don't mean to be disrespectful, but that maybe some of the miracles in the Bible, that those stories got in there to try to invite people into the practice or into the tradition. And it's not that the tradition is not good, and it's not that it's not good to market these things, but maybe some of the ways in which historically different spiritual traditions have tried to entice people to follow their path, even for the good of the person following the path, is through idealized images of what will happen if you do this. And there may even be a value to that, the same way there's a value, for example, to a physician or psychologist posturing with some degree of authority, even though they have uncertainty, in order to convey some confidence to try to help the patient maybe, give a try to a treatment plan, right? There might be a certain value to that, even if the most honest presentation would be deep uncertainty.
Well, there's a place way down at the bottom of my heart that's really happy to hear you respond like that, Ron, because I am a bit of a risk taker, and I felt the fear in asking you that question, the question of orthodoxy, the question of the dogma and orthodoxy, all that stuff. And your response is just very freeing for me to hear.
It's interesting, the Buddha himself apparently based on what's been handed down to us, talked about this idea of the Pali term is ehipassiko, and it roughly translates as come and see for yourself. And he said, don't trust any of these principles that I'm putting out myself. Try the practices I'm suggesting and see what you discover in the laboratory of your own mind. See whether the principles that I've discovered, in essence, turn out to be principles that describe your experience. But, this is this idea that if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him, which is like a bizarre thing in a religious tradition. But it was based on ehipassiko, the idea that no, the doctrine's there to point a certain way, but then you have to do the experiment yourself and be an empiricist and see whether these principles seem to apply or not. And at least that fits my sensibility much more readily than a more orthodox kind of view.
At the moment, I'm imagining Carl Jung sitting with the Buddha and sharing one of his famous quotes with the Buddha. Hey, Buddha, I'm so glad I'm Jung and not a Jungian.
Yeah.
And the Buddha like nodding rigorously saying, I'm so glad I'm Buddha and not a Buddhist.
Yeah, I think that's how it works. And it's also understandable to have this very human wish to find a pathway out of suffering, right? To identify with something and believe in it. And I even think within the psychotherapy field, I have quite a few friends and colleagues who have developed systems where they train people systematically in that system. And, you come in, as you say, as a neophyte. And if you take a certain number of trainings, you advance up the ladder. And on the one hand, it's a very good way to disseminate skills, right? You can learn that way. Yeah. But on the other hand, it does tend to get us into thinking that this is the way rather than a way. And it gets us into thinking that there really is a somewhat rigid hierarchy of seniority that corresponds to ability or understanding, whereas it's really, I think the world's a much more fluid place than that.
Yeah. It brings me back to this connection versus impression thing. And I'm feeling into longing. Mm-hmm. Because I think longing is one of the things that we don't do well categorically as humans. We stuff our longing into idealization structures. Mm-hmm. And the longing is way too big for that.
Yeah. I think, just personally, it's taken me a long time to become relatively comfortable with longings. It's taken me a long time to become relatively comfortable with sadness, in part because I think both longing and sadness, and this may be more true with men or people who identify as more masculine, longing and sadness are seen as what losers experience. That if we were really successful, and however we define that, if we were really special in a good way, then we wouldn't have longings and we wouldn't have sadness. We'd just be experiencing the high of winning a lot, the high of being on top, the high of getting what we want. And I don't think that's actually how it works, because even people that are quite at the top seem to have a lot of longings. I don't think we'd have billionaires competing over whose rocket went higher into space if it weren't that these things persist at very high levels of achievement. And there's this embarrassment about having a broken heart, about having longings, about all of this. It really does tie into all our self-esteem preoccupation, because it's like, if we were really okay, we wouldn't be experiencing this. But I think the reality is, when we're really okay, we experience it a lot, and we're able to make friends with that in ourselves.
Mm-hmm. So we have extraordinary on one end of a continuum and ordinary on the other end. And one of the things I love about Zen is the tradition nurtures a relationship with paradox and complexity. And so there's a way that both can be held in a sort of unusual way that is riddled with complexity. And there's a riddling way. And it reminds me of Alan Watts, right, who had this phrase called the principle of irreducible rascality, which I just love, that there's something rascally in the fabric that just can't be reduced to this continuum or that binary. And I love how you're playing with ordinary and extraordinary. I love that there's play there. I'm wondering if I can throw in an idea into the soup so that we can continue to play with this paradox. So in a certain geography of Jungian thought and some of his followers, there's an archetype known as the royal archetype, the king and queen. And in psychological terms, a little bit more traditional psychological terms, this would be the narcissistic area of the psyche. And I personally think that narcissism discourse is totally fucked. It doesn't encounter, it doesn't contact and connect with the deep yearning in the human to be special. It just kind of, displaces it and negatively idealizes those that are kind of, entranced by the specialness thing and somehow displaces it then. So I feel like narcissism discourse is really irresponsible insofar as this royal archetype stuff. And I feel like the way that you're talking about it, I just vibe with it because it's kind of like, okay, there's a longing in the human for specialness. Like, what can we do with that as a given? Am I reading you right about that?
You are, and you're actually shining a light on something which is, in my exploration of it, really complicated. That there's a lot of angles to it. Maybe I can just name a few of those. One is, indeed, we do long for the specialness, right? And this has a few different elements to it. One of them is back to being a social mammal, right? That, why were those guys competing to be the dominant ones? Well, it turns out that if you're dominant in a primate troop, your chances of successfully reproducing and taking care of your offspring and passing on your genes are increased. So there's going to be a very basic longing for this, right? As basic as is, I haven't drunk water in a long time, there's going to be a longing for water after a while. So there's going to be that level of it. And then there's a whole other level, which is our longing for love, which is set up very early in our infancy, because to be a human infant and to not be loved was a death sentence. So all human infants come into the world with a longing for love because we need to be cared for. We need to be loved just to survive. And then that takes on enormous psychological power as we spend our whole lives longing for love. And it's very easy to start conflating these two and thinking, well, if I were a celebrity, then everybody would love me. If I looked gorgeous, then everybody would love me. If I was really clever or kind or whatever it is that I'm judging myself on, if I had those attributes, then everybody would love me. So the sort of wanting to improve our self-esteem and our social rank and longing for love have a very complicated mix in there. And then let's just throw in one more and then we could talk about it. One more is there's the question of when people are particularly narcissistic, is this, as most clinical psychologists tend to see people who are like, trying to show off as it being compensatory, right? We've had wounds as a kid. We felt rejected. We felt inadequate. We felt criticized. And we compensate for that because the pain of that is really, really rough to sit with. We compensate with these fantasies of I'm the best, I'm the most special, like that. But it's kind of paper thin, right? And it's sitting on top of a well of insecurity. The social psychologists see it somewhat differently, actually. They say, nope, a lot of narcissists are just deluded. They've been told that they're the greatest. They're like the prince or whatever, or the princess. They've been told they're the greatest and they bought this narrative and they actually believe in this thing. It's not compensatory. There's something underneath. And there's probably different mixtures of this, right? In those of us who are more narcissistic. So this is all to say that it's really complicated and it's really human. Like even if we're not considered by our friends to be narcissistic, we all struggle with this stuff because we all want to be special. We all want to be loved. We all have this desire to rank highly in our little primate troops. There's a lot going on.
So I'm thinking about Alice Miller's work, classical work, the drama of the gifted child, where the subconscious of the mother or the caregiver subconsciously coerces the child into being a quote unquote narcissistic extension of the caregiver. And I think this is a really important idea because it's not just us that have a longing for specialness. It's that we project it deeply onto our children, deeply, deeply, deeply. And I personally think that this shows up very much, and this is why I like to call it an archetype in the world's religions, because you have, the baby in the manger. It's not just the baby, the historical baby in the mythological narratives, the religious narratives. It's like a Christian family has a sort of subconscious projection onto their baby, that their baby is the baby in the manger, even though they wouldn't, consciously claim that for the most part. And so you have this royal archetype, the royal little baby, and, a child brought up in that environment where the caregiver's unconscious is coercing them and saying, you are going to be my unconscious vision for you to be great in the world. I can't do it. I didn't do it. I'm a failure. I'm just a natural, ordinary human or something like that. But you are the royal baby.
Yeah.
And you're going to carry on the tradition, and you're going to do the things that I couldn't do, and you're going to carry it further. So I'm kind of thinking that it shows up very much so, and you can see it in religious narratives where you have, with the Buddha, right? The Buddha was royal.
Right.
Yeah.
That's absolutely, I think it's another facet of this. And well, I mean, you're a parent now. I don't know if your 5-year-old is your oldest child or whether you have older ones.
We have a 16-year-old as well.
Oh, okay. So you know this at different developmental levels, but I mean, my gosh, how's my kid doing? And us feeling, I'll talk myself as a father, feeling good or bad about myself based on whether my child seems to be thriving or not in whatever realm is important to me. For one person, it's going to be, are they a virtuoso musician? For someone else, it's going to be, are they kind? But sure, our kids easily become extensions of us, and then our self-esteem goes up and down depending on how they're doing.
I think we're teasing at the idealization that's implicit in attachment psychology, aren't we?
Well, attachment psychology is interesting because as somebody who's been very involved in Buddhist psychology, people will often say, well, wait a minute, isn't a goal of Buddhist spiritual path relinquishing attachment, right? And how come there's all this emphasis on attachment in human developmental psychology? And I actually think Bowlby, who coined the term attachment to describe the way in which a caregiving primate takes care of, comforts, soothes, and really lends their emotional maturity to the baby, that Bowlby kind of blew it by using the word attachment. Had he called it connection psychology, we would look at this differently. If we're simply saying the parent and the child have to feel connected, they have to feel safely connected for development to go well, then I think the whole, the sort of narcissism or self-esteem dimension would be less important. There's a distinction, I think, may be useful here between self-esteem and self-compassion nowadays. Right. So self-esteem is our propensity to evaluate ourselves and think I'm doing well or I'm not doing well on whatever criteria matters to me. For one person, it's intelligence. For somebody else, it's looks. For somebody else, it's their kindness. But to always be thinking, Ron's doing well or not, Ron's not doing well. Self-compassion is very different. Self-compassion is the ability to sweetly hold and love ourselves, but that's not based on comparisons. So, for example, if we were in the role of a parent, and our kid came home and they were really depressed because they had really wanted to make the baseball team and it was a competitive tryout and they didn't make the team. And we were thinking of self-esteem as a pathway to well-being. We would say to our child, oh, honey, I'm so sorry you didn't make the team. I know that must be rough, but remember in the fall, you were really the star player on the basketball team. And this last January, in mathletes, you were the top kid in the school. You are a smart kid. You are a good athlete. And yeah, this is a disappointment, but you're going to win again, in no time. That would be like, let's help support self-esteem. And a lot of parents do that. We do that because we know it feels good to feel good about ourselves and we don't want to see our kids suffering. if we were trying to cultivate self-compassion, it would go very differently. We would say something like, "Oh, sweetheart, that must be so hard for you. I know you really practiced. I know it really meant a lot to you. When I was your age, I was really into theater and I so wanted to be the star in the school play, and I thought I was perfect for the part. And I tried out and I didn't get it. And I was really pretty crushed. I spent a couple of weeks feeling very down. It's so hard in life. We win sometimes, we lose sometimes. We can't control it. It's so painful when we lose. We're all, this is something we all share. Can I give you a hug, sweetheart?" One, developing the capacity to be with the feelings and to be okay, but not putting out the, "If I could win, then I'd be happy, and let me help you feel like a winner." How do we instead connect and feel love with the ups and downs of life that are so inevitable?
I like this connection as a reframe, like connection psychology as a
Yeah, so
reframe
attachment
to
is about
attachment.
connection.
Yeah, I like that. And connection, like the thread that, or the glue that's holding this discussion together, is this latest book of yours, like orienting to the ordinary. Like, we are ordinary humans. We suffer, period. First noble truth. And it's like, what I was getting at before with the attachment psychology thing is that I think that especially women and mothers, but all of us, but especially I think women and mothers, their psychological makeup is such that they are primed. They have a Velcro hook there, that they're primed to take on responsibility for the misgivings of their children. If something goes wrong, and then like attachment psychology implicit in it is like, if you do a good enough job, there will be this ideal child that is ideally self-regulated. And that comes from the mother-child dyad in the first critical periods. This is Alan Shore's work and McMindfulness and all that stuff, right? That a good caregiving dyad is going to produce a self-regulated being. And then the Velcro hook.
And implicitly, they won't suffer.
Yeah. Implicitly, they won't suffer. That's exactly what I'm getting at, right? And then so you had the Velcro hook of the mom. It's often the mom, but us dads too, right? It's taking responsibility, but I'm often holding the pole that you're holding. Like, hey, no matter how good I do, our child is still going to suffer.
And we can only be as content as our least contented child. I mean, if we're all, it's going to hurt.
Yeah.
It's suffering. I was just co-leading a workshop. It was a compassion workshop. And there's a woman there who's a psychologist who has a child who's higher functioning on the autism spectrum, probably what we would call Asperger's. And she was like ready to start shrieking, saying, "If I hear or attend one other attachment workshop talking about the centrality of attachment and how important that is for your kids' development, that's not talking about neurodiversity in kids, and the fact that, there are some kids who don't want you to touch them. There are some kids who you can't hug because, that's their neurological makeup. And it's not the parents' fault, damn it. So she was like, recovering. Well, she was suffering deeply from this. And a voice was rising up in her saying exactly what you're saying. Wait a minute. Let's not lay this all on the feet of, there must be something wrong with you as a parent if your child is suffering in this way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what do you make of, this is a new outgrowth in the conversation, this question. It might feel unrelated, but I think we'll tie it back to the larger question of identity and how identity is related to idealization. Now, let me just leave it at that for now. How do you think human identities are related to idealization?
It's so interesting because if we reflect on how we feel about our identities, most of us find that we kind of like some more than others, that some are associated with a kind of self-esteem boost.
Yeah.
And others are associated with not so much, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if I were to say, oh, yes, I'm on the faculty of Harvard Medical School. That's an identity, right?
Which identity are we talking about? Yeah.
And that's associated with a boost. And if I were to say to you, well, if you were to see my artistic creations, you'd say, did a third grader draw that? That's not associated with a boost. And then we have all the identities that are, marginalized or not, right? So many people are in groups that have been oppressed or marginalized or at the bottom of some social hierarchy, and they feel lousy about themselves because they're fill in the blank, whichever group they happen to be part of. And there are others, right, who are clinging to the idea that, oh, my identity is at the top of the rat heap and I want to keep it there to try to feel good about myself. So, on the one hand, I think we have to respect identities and we have to understand all of the psychological implications of them, whether it's me being a sort of white, cisgendered, educated male, the sort of, that confers a certain social rank, or somebody else being, identified with groups in which they've really been injured by their identity. I think we have to respect that and also notice that, oh boy, this caused a lot of unnecessary suffering. Like actually identifying with our identities and really believing that we're something other than regular human beings here together also causes a lot of suffering. And it's tricky to balance these, right? To respect the meaning and the importance of the identity on the one hand, and how much emotion is connected to it. And also to be able to step back and realize, wow, this stuff is so arbitrary. And it's so arbitrary that, this particular group that, that we won a genetic lottery or something and wound up in one group instead of another group, or lost a genetic lottery, depending on how we see it.
Yeah.
And seeing that how kind of crazy the identities are on the other hand.
So there's a woman named Ruth Lays that wrote a book called The Genealogy of Trauma. It's a really brilliant book. And in that book, she says that the age of the hero has been replaced by the age of the victim. That the victim is the new hero. Now, I don't know what to say about the current political climate because things are changing, and she was writing within the context of her times. But I'm just saying that the complexity, and you're taking us in this direction of the complexity of a victim identity. A lot of people are actually victimized. You know what I mean? Structurally, in terms of structural oppression and things like that.
Injured or continue to be. Mm-hmm.
And there's becomes this complexity because I tell students, one of the hardest things to do clinically is to work with a victim-identified individual who's running perpetrator energy unconsciously.
Mm-hmm.
Can you unpack that a little bit for the audience? I'm used to saying it that way. Can you say it in your way and tell me how you're making sense of it?
That when we've been injured, especially repeatedly, it's likely we're going to feel a lot of hurt and anger about that. And that hurt and anger is going to manifest in some way. And one way that it might manifest is by being very critical or condemning of some group that we think of as privileged in some way. So that happens, right? We're in a very understandable and very natural way. And then there's all sorts of other things. Politics are so fraught these days. So not to give a particular example, but there are certainly many examples of groups that were subjugated, that once they gained power themselves, they subjugated the other, that the hurt and anger got played out, sometimes in horrible atrocities.
This happens in everyday households every day, right?
Yeah.
I call it the ledger in couples therapy with a capital letter L. The ledger.
Right.
Like you've done this harm to me or I've done this good to you, and it's going in the ledger.
Yeah. And I'm going to now punish you, righteously punish you for having done harm to me, which isn't to say that bona fide injustice isn't a problem which we should try to stop. It's complicated. Yeah. As you were talking about these paradoxes and holding opposites, somehow holding the need to make the world as just a place as possible, including our little household worlds on the one hand, and on the other hand, not getting into these kinds of ledger things. I used to teach workshops on forgiveness, and I did a pretty deep dive into the forgiveness literature, of which there's a pretty broad empirical literature. From the not so scientific study end, the most moving exploration of this that I came across was from Desmond Tutu and his daughter, and I apologize, his daughter's name is difficult for an English speaker to pronounce, and I'm not going to get it right, but Desmond Tutu's daughter. They're basically talking about the truth and reconciliation process after apartheid fell in South Africa. Very meaningful, very interesting exploration of forgiveness. And one of the things I was left with was, wow, if they can do it, I sure should be able to do it, in my life with the relatively tiny injuries that I've experienced. I think this is where spiritual dimensions are actually helpful to us, where it's really important to have some goal other than tit for tat, some goal other than what about me, that shapes our outlook and our actions. And all these forgiveness processes start with, got to be able to acknowledge your pain. You have to be able to go back to the trauma, acknowledge what happened, feel it, notice all the emotional texture, how hard it was, notice and identify with the anger, see all that, feel all that thoroughly. And then might there be another phase where we can hold it from a broader perspective and see what made the perpetrator be the perpetrator they were, what maybe contributed to my victim role, those kinds of perspectives. It's a complex and nuanced process, but I do think that exploring pathways to forgiveness is one way to not get caught into this idea of a victim identity, which can be constricting and not useful.
I see. So the work of connection, the work of compassion, I'm thinking about that, there's a part of the complexity. You have a kind of claim, maybe a hidden claim to specialness. We've talked about specialness a bit, that urge. We could even call maybe the archetype of specialness, the royal archetype, if we want to call it that. But one of the ways that it shows up is I'm special in my brokenness. I'm special in my marginalized identity.
Mm-hmm.
I'm special in the list goes on and on and on and on. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking about one of the cases I'm working with who has this person has a partner that is identified as being neurodivergent. And there's a sense where their partner regularly uses their identity, as a neurodiverse person, as a kind of iron wall against taking responsibility for their part in argument.
Yeah, it's very tricky. I will say that as a, cisgendered, white, educated guy and all that, right. There's a territory where I feel like I know my experience better than I know the experience of people in different groups. I want to honor not knowing really. I mean, I've spoken to people, I've tried to educate myself, but not really knowing what these other experiences are like. And what you're saying brings quite plausibly to me, right? That, well, of course, I often think that we as humans are very much like the chimps that you see in the Jane Goodall movies, right? Chimps are kind of messing around, doing different things. And at some point they find a stick and they kind of almost accidentally stick the stick into a hole, and the ants start crawling up the stick and they get it. Oh, well, this kind of works. Well, we're messing around in our lives, trying this and that randomly, and we accidentally bump into things that kind of work for us in some way, and then we start using them. And sometimes the thing that kind of works is what you're talking about, right? Like, okay, I have an identity that's going to be of use to me here. It would seem that would make sense that we would do that kind of thing because we're kind of always doing that.
I love it. I love the image. It's very visceral. It's very phylogenetic, to be fancy, right? It lines up with the evolutionary psychiatry frame, and it's funny. So it's functional for me. I really like it. there's something, and you handled it very responsibly. I appreciate how you responded to my question, that I have my experience. I was born into unearned privileges, structural privileges by the nature of the fact that I'm hetero cis. Those are unearned privileges. Okay. And it's element of structural power. And there's a element in the kind of wider discourse which basically says, if you don't have my lived experience, you can't connect with me at all. I'm going to just claim it as an idealization or a reduction in complexity, because if we can't reach and find our places of similarity, and one of the places of our similarity is our suffering,
and I'm a big fan. I mean, this may be coming from my particular lived experience. I want to voice over again.
Yeah.
But I notice subjectively, like whenever I'm with someone who's from a very different background than I am, or occupies a different niche in the social order, and we can connect around something that feels vulnerable and real and genuine, and like, there is the shared human experience, that always feels very good to me. I think we're wired for love in this way. I think that when we're able to connect in this way, that sense of safe social connection is just so sweet. And as your daughter saying, this gladness in the bottom of her heart, that happiness in the bottom of her heart has something to do with connecting to daddy in the moment, and probably mommy and others as well, right? It is a very sweet thing. And at the same time, part of connecting means noticing that other people do have different lived experiences, and we kind of have to ask them what's the pathway that works for them to be able to connect.
Yeah. I'm thinking again about the connection versus impression dialectic that you brought, because I think being able to make connectives between lived experiences that may seem on a superficial level that they're significant and that there's a wall there. It takes imagination to make connectives. It takes compassion. It takes orienting to a shared root. And I think a great contender for that is suffering.
Yeah. Yeah. Getting that everybody struggles with loss, that everybody longs for the self-esteem stuff, even if it doesn't serve us well. Right. Mm-hmm. But everybody wants to be held in high regard. Everybody wants to have other people like them, respect them. We have this in common. Everybody struggles with shame. Yeah, I've never been able to find the quote. I heard it secondhand that Carl Rogers, who was, really a genius of the psychotherapy field, that Rogers had said something like, isn't it interesting that shame, which is the experience that I am somehow out of the human family, right? I'm not fit to be with the group in some way. When we feel shame, we feel like we don't want people to see us. We don't want them to see this aspect of us because we feel so bad about ourselves in this way. And that the irony is that it's one of the most universal of human emotions. Everybody feels this experience of not fit to be part of the human family, at least at times. And, how strange is that, right? That we're all vulnerable to this. It makes us feel separate, but we're actually in that together. And I think when we can be in environments that allow us to honor that and allow us to share that with one another, we can relax, and it feels so much better than winning at the self-esteem game.
Yeah. You can't feel empathy really if you can't feel shame.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It's a very important piece. It begs the question about antisocial personality disorder, because there's some movements in the literature, some articulations in the literature that some folks with antisocial disorder can't feel shame.
Yeah. And we certainly don't want, much as shame is powerful and difficult for us, we certainly don't want people to be shameless, right? Shameless behavior in the world.
Yeah.
But
Gosh,
it is
what a
interesting.
walk. And then back to the identity wars, because you could, I mean, that is just low-hanging fruit for I'm innocent and that person is antisocial, or that person doesn't have it, or that person is narcissistic. It's just the just clusterfuck of complexity around identity. It's just
I find an interesting exercise to conjure in our minds. The political arena, at least in the United States, is such low-hanging fruit now. I'll say, conjure somebody who you think of as really bad, who's in the other political party, whoever that is for you. We can make this so that it's accessible to everybody. And how are you like that person?
yeah.
What are the ways in which I'm like that person? Can be very, very interesting as an exploration. Because we all have all these aspects in us.
Yeah. Well, that is a good experiment. Yep. And it takes imagination. Empathy and imagination have a connection, I believe.
Yeah.
Right. If you lack imagination, you're going to lack the further reaches of empathy.
Right. There's this construct, certain schools of psychology, of theory of mind, which is this capacity to imagine, as you're saying, what might the other person's experience be like? And some people are actually quite good at that. They're quite intuitive, and they can imagine others' experiences. And for others, not so much practice in that. But I think it is enormously helpful for getting along with one another, and enormously helpful for the ordinariness part, because we start to realize that the other person that we may think of as super good or super bad, right? It goes both ways. As you were pointing out at the beginning of our conversation, that the idealization and the denigration they're kind of connected to each other, right? Not seeing the other as a regular human being. When we're looking at another person in this way, we're not seeing the way in which they're like us, and we're also not seeing in the way that they came to be who they are quite by accident. If I think you talked about unearned privilege, right, and talking about things like being white or male or that kind of thing, but I frankly don't have any earned privileges either. You know, when I think of the things that I grew up in a family where my parents were both teachers, so they encouraged education. So getting an education was just what you did. You grew up in my family, and I had, the ability to enter schools and whatnot. Even the habit of working diligently enough to write some books and do things like that. I mean, I didn't come up with that. That was just, conditioning, genetics. When we really look at ourselves, we realize that nothing's actually exactly earned or unearned, because who we are is just this unfolding of all these conditions and factors and forces that produce this particular organism that, that goes by our name.
It's interesting to zoom out to that level about our species, like in terms of our endowment, our cognitive and neural endowment. Like, that's quite debatable, quite paradoxical. Was it earned, not earned? Not really. We're just given, we had this.
If we take natural selection seriously, and that happens to be my cosmology, I think Darwin was onto something about the origin of the species. It's all an accident. It's all an accident. It's an unbelievably complex accident, and it has beauty and a sense of meaning and all of that. But it's all an accident that humans developed these brains that can do all this stuff, and that now are allowing us to do video podcasts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the role of the dice in the fabric of things is really underappreciated as a fact.
And it's part of the ordinariness thing, because the assumption, let's take something like success in the business world, just for an example. It's very hard to actually study this, but I think it's reasonable to assume that when, let's take 10 entrepreneurs, and one of them strikes it rich, comes up with an idea which at this particular time and place in history, and with this particular financial support, is able to have some kind of meteoric rise. is it likely that that person, let's say that person's rise represents 100-fold what their competitor was able to achieve? Is it likely that that person's skill set is actually 100-fold greater than their competitor who didn't make it so far? Or was it a lot of being in the right place at the right time, both people being reasonably smart, reasonably entrepreneurial, reasonably gutsy, having the equipment, but one wins and the other doesn't win in these kinds of lotteries? It's probably much, much closer to accurate. Not that you don't need a certain level of certain skills and abilities and the like to make something happen, but of all the people who have those abilities, there's so much randomness, and whether or not you have those abilities is random.
Yeah. Well, take that, Huberman. When you listen to this episode, take that. Listen to this, man. I'm thinking about shared skill sets, right, with neuroscience and all that stuff, but also species do that. They mutate. I went through a really interesting journey in my book about how genetic mutations happen, sometimes in response to cosmic gamma rays that are fluctuating through the Milky Way. And, it's interesting to think that, we're in this cosmic predicament and which feels so special and like mind-blowingly enormous, like how to hold this paradox of ordinary and extraordinary. It's the weirdest thing that we're here.
And the most sophisticated thing that you or I are doing in this whole conversation is digesting our breakfast or lunch, right? Even though we're playing with all these interesting ideas, but how we doing it? I think I couldn't tell you. I don't have that figured out at all.
Oh gosh, I love that. Well, I have to share this again because I'm just so awestruck by this, and you really appreciate the chimp literature. I want to share this again for those of you listeners that have heard this before. I hope you'll enjoy it again because I just love this research, and maybe it'll be a nice throwback for you, Ron. That because it comes from a Durkheimian, somebody that is really into the work of Emile Durkheim, the great sociologist of religion. So she did a study. I wish I had her name, but it's a Russian name. And even though I study Russian, I don't have it dialed in. It's a book over the last few years or something like that. And we can put it in the show notes. So she drew from chimpanzee literature about how chimps, that when they approach waterfalls, they go into a collective expression. What Durkheim called it was collective effervescence. So when they're near a waterfall, they go into a series of rhythms and sounds and stuff like that in relationship with the waterfall that is quite simply extraordinary. It's out of the ordinary in terms of what they do in other social scenarios. It's very much a social drama. And now they even studied that the chimps get a goosebump response. And so I'm a goosebump researcher. And this might be a segue into the psychedelic stuff because, I find that on psychedelics, but also in moments of, and this, again, just dancing with the paradox of extraordinary and ordinary, that in extraordinary experiences that I get goosebumps regularly. The tingle response. And that's what they find to be the case as a sort of, and they're calling it proto-religious phenomenon in chimps, where they go into this rhythmic sequencing of articulations and pant hoots, and then they get the goosebump response. What do you make of that?
I'm more familiar with humans than chimps.
That's your lived experience.
And we humans have been inducing non-ordinary states for psychological transformation for a very long time, right? Based on cave paintings and what we see in hunter-gatherer populations, chanting, ecstatic dancing, sweat lodges, wilderness journeys, fasting.
Piercing oneself on the arbor,
Yeah. I mean, we've been doing stuff to change, to shift away from our normal self-focused, goal-oriented behavior, oh, I'm hungry. What can I have for lunch?
Even kids, right? Going around in circles until they fall flat.
Totally. And, moving away from, oh, I have sexual interest. How do I find a partner right now? All this, or, oh, I want to feel better about myself. How do I enhance my self-esteem? How do I get more likes on social media to come back to where we were? All this kind of goal-oriented stuff. These non-ordinary states, some of which are ecstatic non-ordinary states, are states in which instead of this, we feel very connected to something larger than ourselves. We've stepped out of the thought stream. So we're not preoccupied with thought. We're usually at some level of sensation. We're in the flow. So we're kind of getting it that everything's very transient. And we're not trying to block something out or hold on to something. We're not trying to get rid of pain or hold on to pleasure. We've been evoking these states for a very long time. And they occur in psychotherapy. They occur, for example, with the psychedelics, as you mentioned. They occur in meditative practices. Right. And it sounds like the chimps are involved in something somehow similar that helped them to have a sense of connection to something larger than themselves, not in their normal primate, let me get what I want for me, but doing something that helped them to feel part of the group and that it feels pretty good to them, apparently.
Yeah.
So it makes sense that that's a proto-religious experience, because so many of these non-ordinary states show up in religious traditions also. And what they lead us to is some kind of transpersonal awareness where we are less preoccupied with ourselves and we are more connected instead.
I think if we drill down further with the drill bit of ordinary, a really interesting layer down there is that our species ... is just ordinary.
Yeah, we're just another one. I mean, it's amazing what nature has produced. I mean, a leaf is unbelievable.
Yeah.
And the human extraordinary. And it might all be a big, interesting accident.
And what happens then? Because I think there's some implicit assumption, and I think this is the crux in terms of idealizations in humanity is that are we animals or not animals? Because it's like, as soon as we say and we join together as like, okay, there's evolution is a thing and it's a fact and chance is involved in the universe, we're immediately binarized. We're with the theists, right?
Yeah, no, I do think, and I don't mean to offend anybody, and we can have different views and they can all have their utility. But I do think that one of the errors that some of the world's religious traditions have made is assuming that we're not mammals, because there's so many indications that we're mammals. And as mammals, we have various instincts, various impulses and the like. And I do think, in fact, one way to understand Freud's great contribution was Freud said, we appear to be mammals. And this brings up challenges for getting along in human societies, because we have sexual impulses, we have aggressive impulses, we have greed, we have all these not so noble instincts that cause trouble. Now, we also have other instincts which are really helpful for getting along. We have instincts toward cooperation. We have instincts toward justice. We have instincts toward love. But, sometimes we have a lot more trouble usually with the more me, individually oriented mammalian instincts. And the world's religions that suggest, well, you should be able to get rid of those, whether it's the Buddhist line about eliminating greed, hatred, and delusion, or what we see in many other traditions that you shouldn't have sinful thoughts or desires. That's tough. And as a psychologist, I don't think it's very possible to do that without, considerable costs in terms of increased suffering. So I do think that traditions that are broadly tantric, and by this, I mean, those of you who are older and remember, oh yeah, I heard something about tantric yoga. That's where you get to have sex and call it spiritual development. No, that's not what these traditions were about. They were about can we honor our instincts? Can we honor our mammalian instincts and use them as part of our path to spiritual development or awakening? I think I think we've had a better shot with that, just because it doesn't seem to me like my mammalian nature is going anywhere soon.
Yeah, I really respect Jaak Panksepp as a biologist. He's a neuroscientist that I really value, and he talks about basic emotions in cortical or subcortical midbrain structures. One of the systems, emotional systems, that he asserts that all mammals share is what he calls the care system, which is endogenous opioids, oxytocin, vasopressin. Believe it or not, prolactin is a bonding chemical for men. Well, lactin, you know what I mean? So it's like, that's very mammalian.
Yeah, that we're made to love also, right?
That we're made to love. And that's a bonding. It's a space of bonding. It's the space of connection, And it sure would be nice to have a little bit more activism around that,
Well, I think there's this classic story. It's sometimes attributed to a Cherokee tradition. It shows up in other traditions also, where there's a grandfather and he's with his grandson, and his grandson's been getting into a bunch of trouble in school or whatnot by, acting basically on his less noble instincts. And the grandfather's saying to his grandson, it's as though there are two wolves living inside of you. And one of them is kind of greedy and impulsive and angry and wants what he wants when he wants it. And the other one is loving and caring and cooperative and just wants to be close to other people. And they're fighting with each other. And the grandson says, yes, Grandpa, I feel it. Which wolf is going to win? And the grandfather says, whichever one you feed.
Yeah.
That basic story, which shows up in different forms, that's super important, because we've got this broad array of instincts, right? We have this mammalian tend and befriend and love and nurturing instinct and cooperative instincts and justice instincts. And we've got these other ones that are very I, me, mine oriented. And I'm not doing this as a moralistic thing. One set of instincts actually brings us a lot more well-being than the other one does. Right? We can't win at the self-esteem game. We can't win at the being on top, because we're constantly recalibrating, right? We come up with new people to compete with and new standards to have to reach. And what goes up goes down. So we don't stay on top for very long. And so we're constantly struggling if we put the energy into the individualistic self-esteem wolf, if you will. But there's this other wolf we can feed, and that's knowing that can really help us orient ourselves in the world in a way that makes us happier and actually makes those around us happier too.
This is really interesting. I love talking with you. So, as a non-dogmatic guy and with an approach to the deep relationship with the ordinary and with chance, how do you find meaning? If we're just on a pale blue dot and we're going to die out like every other species, we're going to just die like every other species, and we're just going to be, how do you find meaning?
Well, my understanding of meaning's one of our instincts, right? Humans have the propensity to create a sense of meaning. And when I examine my own experience and the experience of patients or friends I've known well, it seems that the things that create meaning are actually moments of connection, right?
Yeah.
It feels, I'm going to speculate based on my feeling as you tell your story about your daughter, it is inherently super meaningful to be with her and have this discussion about the happiness at the bottom of your heart. I don't care if we're all going to die tomorrow. I don't care if we're on a pale blue dot. That feels meaningful to us. In the same way, it feels meaningful to us when the organism is doing what it's kind of made to do, right? The idea of a flow experience where we're just engaged in the activity, whether it's skiing down the mountain or cooking oatmeal, and we're fully engaged in it, it just feels meaningful to us. Connection feels meaningful. Being present feels meaningful. love feels meaningful. They just feel meaningful. So do I think there's ultimately meaning? Do I feel life to be deeply meaningful? Yes.
But I'm imagining you can feel the longing in you that rips you apart so much that you would want to create a meaning that's more than that. You know what I mean? Like
I feel pretty damn fortunate that I have these little kinds of ordinary meaning experiences.
well, that's cool because I'm just trying to get at like, the forcefulness of the longing to have something more than these little pockets of meaning, such that, and I'm framing them as like the driver for the big ontologies of the world and the big religions, that there has to be something more than just these sweet moments of contact that fade into memory or even disappear.
I think that happens more. Look, one of the advantages of all these years of Buddhist meditation practice and interest in this is I sometimes get it that everything is indeed impermanent and transitory.
Mm-hmm.
Not always, by any means. I'm often in denial of death. I'm often in denial of loss and all that. But sometimes I get it, right, that this is the case. So sometimes, there's this very famous Zen story of a Zen monk, and he's being chased by a tiger, and he's at the edge of a cliff. The tiger's about to get him. He leaps over the edge of the cliff. He grabs hold of this branch that's sticking out from the edge of the cliff. He's holding on with one hand. He looks down below. There's two other tigers circling below. And he notices this strawberry. And he takes the strawberry and he says, how sweet it tastes. Now, I'm not hanging out at that level of awareness of the Zen monk, but I also get it. I also get what they're pointing to in this story. And there are some times where I'm able to have a sweet moment with my wife or one of my kids or a friend, or I was just cross-country skiing a couple of days ago and the body was still working, even though I'm an old guy. And just the moment of appreciation that, how cool is this? And that feels meaningful, even though I don't see we are in a pale blue dot, and scientists are actually split about this. In something like another 5 billion years, long time horizon, but nonetheless, either the sun is going to expand to such a degree that it's going to encompass Earth's orbit and we're all going to fry, or in that expansion, it'll weaken the gravitational field and Earth will fly out somewhere near Pluto and we'll all freeze if we're all here, but the planet will be done for. Yeah, ultimately, you can't have meaning with a capital M, but you can have lovely meaning with a small m.
Nice. Beautiful. Hey, I'm just hoping that you can comment before we close today about your work with chronic pain, and maybe you can bridge the meaning discussion into chronic pain, because we talk a lot about somatics and body stuff. Could you just pitch, like a little bit about your book and what you understand and know about chronic pain?
So the first book I co-wrote was a book called Back Sense. It actually grew out of a personal experience. About 37 years ago, I spent 4.5 months flat on my back with a herniated disc diagnosis. And I was quite miserable, quite struggling with it. In those days, the orthopedic and the neurology advice was that if you had a herniated disc, you needed to stay horizontal as much as possible in the hopes that the disc would heal. And I was doing that and nothing was working. I was super miserable. And this guy at work said, you got to talk to Linda. Now, Linda was a clinical social worker who ran a treatment facility that I knew. I said, Linda, how's she going to help me? I'm seeing all the Harvard orthopedists and stuff, and, they're telling me what to do. What's the social worker going to say? Finally, one day I called Linda and she said, oh yeah, I heard you had a back problem. She said, what are you doing? I said, I'm lying down. It's all I ever do. I was a real peach at the time. She said, why don't you get up and buy groceries? Your wife will appreciate it. I said, I'm incapacitated here. Buy groceries. I can't even walk. She said, and she at that point had gotten turned on to, at that time, very small body of literature that suggested that these disorders were most often psychophysiological, and that whatever was the structural findings, the abnormalities of the spine, were largely coincidental to the disorder. I thought, that's nuts. What does she know? She's a social worker. And I was super frustrated. I had an appointment coming up a couple of weeks hence with a well-known surgeon at one of the well-known Harvard teaching hospitals. And I said, all right, she's so adamant. I'm so miserable. Before I go in for surgery, let me give this a try. And until that point, I realized that I could walk about a city block and then I'd get terrible sciatic pain shooting down my leg. But all right, Linda says by groceries, I'm not going to do that. That would be too heroic, but I'll try walking a little longer. And I went up for a walk and I walked about a city block and right on cue, got the sciatic pain. Linda said, don't let it scare you. Keep going. So I walked another couple of blocks. And then to my utter surprise, I developed sciatic pain shooting down the other leg as well. And now I had pain going down two legs. And I thought, well, that was a brilliant idea. I'm sure glad I listened to Linda. But actually it was, because when I was reading according to the radiology report, it was CAT scans back then. This was before MRI. So this is the early Jurassic period. The disc was shown to be herniated laterally, as they often are. So I should have pain down one leg, but not down the other leg. So what's going on? My first hypothesis was, now I've shattered my spine entirely. I never should have listened to Linda. But my second thought was, could she be right? Could there be something going on here that's not about the structural abnormality in the spine? And I just decided, could be. I'm just going to treat it this way for the next couple of weeks before I see the surgeon. And I did. I decided to try to push past the fear and start using my body normally. And lo and behold, my body started functioning normally. And I still had some pain, but less. And I was starting to sit up. I had been lying down the whole time. It's a terrible experience. I was doing, at a certain point, as a psychologist, I started this bizarre parody of the classical psychoanalytic situation. I would be lying down on a couch in my office while my patients were sitting up and wondering about my prognosis and my terrible. It's terrible. And I started really getting better. Then, so it inspired me, and I canceled this surgery thing, and I got back into my life. And then I started contacting the relatively small group of clinicians who were working from this perspective at that time. And they started sending me patients. We started working collaboratively. And I had already been involved in mindfulness practices for years. We haven't talked about them so much in our interview here, but it occurred to me that, had I understood the dynamics of psychophysiological disorders, mindfulness practices could have been enormously helpful. So I actually started a whole career of working with psychophysiological disorders. And just to make clear what that means is, these are disorders in which some kind of psychological condition, usually a fear response, is causing a dysfunction in the body, in this case, tensing up muscles of the back and the buttocks. And that change in the organ system is creating a symptom, which itself is creating a great deal of psychological distress. A lot of fear, in my case, a lot of anger, a lot of frustration. And then the fear, anger, and frustration feeds back in to the disorder by exacerbating what's happening, in this case, in the muscles. But it's the same thing with the GI system, where people get either irritable bowel syndrome or chronic gastritis, where the dysregulation of the GI system is caused by emotional states, and then those emotional states are reinforced by the upset about the condition. And there are many, many, many. The most common one we all experience is insomnia, is one of these psychophysiological disorders in which, we're not sleeping because we're anxious, and then we get super anxious about not sleeping because we'll be exhausted the next day. And all these things have this quality of turning into a vicious cycle. And pretty much anything that interrupts that vicious cycle can help to free a person from the chronic pain. So it's a whole other thing we could discuss.
It's a positive feedback loop that is awkwardly termed, because it's quite negative a lot of the times, where it's the snake in union with its own tail, and you got a feed forward process, feeding forward fear, feeding forward, predictively simulating more pain, and then it's a loop, right?
And you can get stuck for a very long time.
And then breaking that loop is a meaning-making process. It's work with the meaning instinct, is it not? I mean,
totally. If anybody's interested in this, so the book is called, Back Sense, Halting the Cycle of Chronic Back Pain, and basically have 4 steps to it. And the first one is reasonable medical workup, because you don't want to. I was taught early in my training, it's bad form to psychoanalyze a brain tumor. You think
Unless you're the ideal therapist, right?
there can be, back pain, can be kidney disease, it can be cancer, it can, all sorts of things. You have to rule out those things. But once you have ruled those out and you get a physician or other competent provider who can give you permission to re-engage with your life more normally, then the next phase is really cognitive restructuring, which is about understanding this differently, a meaning-making shift. Once you understand that, this could be one of these feed-forward, as you put it, loops, one of these recursive vicious cycles, once you realize, that could be going on, then it's like, what can I do behaviorally to break that cycle? How can I start living more like a normal person? And then how can I use tools like mindfulness practices to work with all the emotions that come up? Because it's a very emotionally challenging situation to work through one of these chronic pain disorders.
Brilliant. Well, okay, Ron, is there anything else you'd like the audience to know, or any pockets of your work that you'd like to orient them to, conferences, seminars, etc.?
I think we've covered a lot of ground. If you'd like to hear about the different things, I do everything from meditation retreats for psychotherapists to this summer on Cape Cod, talking about learning from non-ordinary states, where we're going to investigate psychedelics on the one hand, but all the other non-ordinary states we use in psychotherapy on the other hand. Just go to Dr. Ron Siegel, spelled like my name.com, and you'll see you can click on join the mailing list and just, let me have your email address and you'll hear about things.
Brilliant. Well, Ron, it's been really fun.
It's been a delight. Thank you for your thoughtful questions and all of your reflections on the topics we've been talking about.
Yeah. Deep and fun. I just love that combo. Hope to talk to you again sometime.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Thank you for listening to the Boundless Body Podcast. Please like us, share, subscribe, and until next time, stabilize, catalyze, and thrive.